Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Morgan Hunt webinar on diversity recruitment, our panel discussion on inclusive recruitment strategies. My name is Clare Keniry, and I am the director at Morgan Hunt responsible for our technology recruitment business, and I also head up diversity and inclusion within our organisation. With record job vacancies in the UK right now, it's more important than ever to ensure that your organisation has an inclusive recruitment strategy that will both enhance your recruitment process, but also improve staff retention. But really, inclusive recruitment is simply recruitment done well. It's good for business and it's about doing the right thing. We've been working very hard over the past 18 months at Morgan Hunt on diversity and inclusion initiatives internally, and we are proud to continue to support our clients developing their diversity strategy via events like this. So I'm delighted to introduce today's panel to you. Firstly, Anne Allcock, who is Head of Diversity at Marshall Learning Consultancy, having spent the past 30 years of her career in equality and diversity roles across various large public sector organisations, from central government departments to universities, and also ran her own successful equality and diversity consultancy. In her current role at Marshall Learning, and supports clients with their diversity strategy and leaders to develop an inclusive culture. We are also joined this morning by Kira van Niekerk, Head of Training and Education at Thomas International, which is a talent assessment organisation supporting businesses with recruitment, development and retention decisions. Kira is a registered psychometrist and an applied psychologist, and she supports the global training team at Thomas. She is also an active member of the Diversity and Inclusion Group at Thomas as well. And finally, a very warm welcome back to Amarjit Singh Basi, founder member of the Black Further Education Leadership Group, which was set up in 2020 to address the challenges associated with systematic racism in further education. Throughout his career, Amarjit has held various leadership roles in further and higher education, including principal and CEO at a number of colleges across the UK, and as part of the Black Further Education Leadership Group campaign, has developed a 10-point plan supporting leaders in the sector to bring about real change and ensure an anti-racist further education system. Before we kick off, a quick note on our format this morning. Our session will take an hour in total, the panel discussion about 45 to 50 minutes, and we then hope to have about 10 minutes at the end, time allowing to address questions from you. So please use the Q&A function to leave questions. We will see them all and we will do our best to answer them, as many as possible. So to kick us off, and it's an obvious starting point, but worth really discussing in terms of context. What is the business case and benefits to an organisation, in your opinion, Amarjit, for workplace diversity?
You partially stole my thunder, Claire, in your intro about the current economic, situation. So what I'm going to do is actually fudge the generic answer response to this and put a challenge back to the audience. If you're not aware of the moral, psychological, cognitive and orthodox business case, my question would be, where have you been for the last year or two, especially, and going well? I'm going to hone into the burning platform, which is now, and Claire's point is, over 1 million vacancies coming out of COVID means that there is now a organisational need to fight for talent. And that means attracting the diversity that hopefully we all seek to identify. A key element of that, and I make no apologies of making it, is actually about ethnic diversity. And going into the post-Brexit era, Britain is going to be even more ethnically diverse than ever before. And the research from the University of Leeds, which I'm very happy to share, absolutely illustrates that two things: those areas that are concentrated now are going to become even more ethnically concentrated, and those areas that hitherto have not been diverse will be diverse in the coming decades. Indeed, by 2030, we will be more ethnically diverse than the US is today. Alongside that, diversity means and makes for better decision making. It engenders a sense of belonging in organisation. And if you retain and engage diverse talent, what you're doing is making a considerable contribution, not only to organisational potential, but individual potential. And surely that should be a double-pronged objective for any organisation.
Thank you, Amarjit. Anne, do you have anything, just to follow up on that from your perspective and your experience over the years?
Yeah, I think, Amarjit is very astute and right to ask the question, where have you been if you aren't thinking about this? And I'd say, you mentioned the last couple of years, but, for the last 5 or 10 years, why aren't you really conscious that a diverse workforce has bottom line business benefits? There's much research now that proves that to be the case. There's obviously also the moral argument, which is just absolutely the right thing to do. Why wouldn't you want to be fair and offer opportunities to all? Also the legal framework, which again is not so often spoken because it's, I suppose, taken as a must do. But everybody wants to make sure that they aren't falling foul of the legislation, and so have to actually have strategies and processes in place to ensure that. I think the other thing that I would like to highlight is whoever your customers are, whoever your clients are, whoever your service users are. They have expectations of organisations around, what can be broadly termed as corporate responsibility, which, diversity and inclusion would fall under that potentially. But also it makes absolute sense, your customers, your markets, if you have a diverse workforce, you stand much more chance of being able to attract and better address the needs of those customers, clients, service users, whatever your business is. So I think that's a really strong and powerful driver as well. Yeah. Yes,
thank you, Anne. And I'm going to ask you, come to you next as well again, Anne. Given your experience, what are your tips on starting the kind of diversity and inclusion journey for some organisations? Because some are still at that stage, and we know it shouldn't start with recruitment. There's so much else that you need to start with first. So when an organisation starts to identify and understands that they have a lack of diversity and they wish to innovate and they wish to do the right thing, what are the key areas that you feel they should begin to tackle initially?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and I think not just for those organisations who perhaps feel they're starting out, but it doesn't do any harm for organisations to revisit this from time to time. What I would say firstly, and what I'd say to organisations is, we often talk about diversity and inclusion journey. Diversity and inclusion are different, so that's quite an important thing to think about. Diversity is about difference. It's about the makeup of your employee group, of your customer profile, the sort of demographics. So in terms of diversity, an obvious thing to be looking at is, what does that look like for your organisation, and to really understand that, not to make assumptions that because another organisation in your sector looks a particular way, that's the way you look as well. It may well not be the case. So really trying to understand that. Inclusion, is something different. It's about how people feel at work. I mean, sometimes talk about it in terms of a party. So diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being invited to dance at the party, and then we're also starting to talk more now about belonging. What does that mean? What does it mean not just to feel included, but to actually belong? And you can look at that as being part of the party planning as well, if you want. So your voice is heard, and people are really making you feel as though you matter to that organisation. So I think analysing and working out what those terms and phrases mean to you and your organisation. But then, of course, there are some sort of key building blocks that you would be sensible to think about and to address. And the first is, perhaps related partially to the understanding the diversity of your employees. It's about data. It's about information on demographic profiles, not just overall, but in different roles, in different functions, different hierarchies, and of course within the recruitment process as well. So that's really important information to capture, and also to disaggregate that, not just looking at Black, Asian, minority ethnic employees, for example, as one group, but breaking that down. So it's really fact finding, but that would also include qualitative experiences as well. So how are you going to capture what the everyday experience of your employees is? So I think data information on an ongoing but also a snapshot basis. Then I think you need to think about what structure have you got in place to manage diversity. Have you got enough resources? Who's accountable? You need to think about those things. And then I suppose, the third sort of building block, or something that I feel really strongly about, is how are you going to involve the people who you are trying to support, or for minority or marginalised groups, you need to get those people involved in a way that's embedded. So think about your structures for being able to do that. And then I would finally say, look at best practice, look within your sector, but look outside your sector, but don't just replicate because somebody else thinks it's a good idea. Modify in a way that you think will work for you.
Great, thank you, Anne. That's pretty comprehensive. Amarjit, I'll come back to you. So what are your tips for ensuring that we bring the whole organisation with us? How do you make internal stakeholders realise that an inclusive recruitment strategy, for example, is not just about, say, hitting quotas or lowering the bar for less qualified candidates to join the organisation? You're just unmuting yourself, I think. Oh, you're back on mute. Apologies, Amarjit.
I do apologise. I think build on Anne's excellent contribution and summary. And one thing to add to Anne's commentary is to show that you really mean it. So authenticity is really, really critical alongside all of those approaches. And through our work in the further education sector and working with organisations, there's 4 components of that, Claire, which I'd just like to share. I think the first one is being shared, and Anne's point about involving everyone, and alongside that, being ambitious. The data is important, but culture is also critical, and the climate and the actions that flow from the research is critical. So ambition is also key. The third factor is that it has to be lively, that it has to animate, it needs to canvas all perspectives, and that's not always comfortable. So the climate by which you embark upon this journey is also critical. And the final characteristic is being true, and very much legitimizing that there will be different starting points, but being true, one, to not only the voices that you hear, but the data that you interrogate, and also in the context of the actions that you take. So in a summary, great diversity inclusion looks like being shared, ambitious, lively and true.
Great, thank you, Amarjit. Ciara, I'll come to you next. I mean, and you'll be very familiar with these because Thomas does a lot of research, I know, and white papers around diversity and inclusion, but the statistics can make pretty depressing reading. At the end of 2020 in the UK, just 3.5% of leaders in the FTSE 100 were from ethnic minority backgrounds, and that's down from 7% in 2019 and 8% in 2018. And also in the UK, the rate at which female leaders are being appointed to the FTSE 100 would mean it will take about 50 years for females to be equally represented. So it can be difficult and probably disheartening for business leaders and anyone who's focused on diversity and inclusion to know where to start in terms of building a diverse workforce and ensuring that they have the correct recruitment tools in place. So what tips would you give them in terms of reviewing any barriers to entry that are not related to the job or skill-based? Kira.
I think that's a really great question. And for me, taking away from what you're actually looking for in terms of that talent, like you said, away from job and skills base, one of the reasons I find a lot of companies can struggle to really attract diverse employees is that their systems or their processes, the brand that they give out, give subtle messages that they're stuck in the past, that they're not really living those values or having the lively discussions, those authentic discussions that Amarjit was talking about there. So if you don't feel that you're going to fit with that culture, you're not going to waste your time applying. And it could be because you want to look for the culture that fits for you, or you're nervous. Is this going to be the culture that's really going to embrace me as well? So diversity inclusion needs to come before recruitment rather than as a result of it. And that's a key difference there. So what are you doing around that recruitment there? So simple things like thinking about where are your job postings being advertised? Are those career sites really accessible to everybody? Do they attract candidates from diverse backgrounds? And maybe get a bit creative with where you're advertising as well. Facebook is something that often people don't really tap into, but if you're part of certain networking groups, you can maybe post directly to there as well as your typical career sites. And also be aware of how you're advertising your organization for those potential new hires as well. So if you're tokenizing your few diverse employees in the advertisement, or you're treating that entire overlooked community as almost like a monolith, like, that everybody that's in the LGBTQ plus community is exactly the same and hey, we've put a rainbow on it. People aren't going to really feel that you're embracing what you're talking about there, right? So we need to embrace that intersectionality because your diverse candidates will notice when it's not really authentic. And then lastly, look at where does your referrals come from? So broadening those referral pools as well. So sometimes a lot of companies have referral programs in-house, and that's great. It's a nice way to get some decent connections, and you're able to also incentivize employees to build up your organization. But sometimes that means that those referrals look exactly like the way your organization is currently. You're not really getting those new kinds of faces, new people involved. So looking at also maybe certain networking groups, there's lots of other ones that you could join. You can maybe even sponsor a networking group or some mentoring to get some new people into your organization as well, and specifically diverse networking groups there as well. Or look at areas of the workforce that have similar skills to what you're looking for. It doesn't have to be the exact same industry, because maybe then you'll find some other diverse ways of thinking as well as your diverse candidates that you could attract there. And those are just some simple tips though.
Great, thank you, Kira. And if I could come back to you, the steps that we all need to take in an inclusive recruitment process are really no different to those we take every day. I mean, in terms of maybe the process we go through. So we source, we screen and interview candidates. However, the key difference is that we remain aware and alert for potential bias, and most importantly, are committed to overcoming those behaviours. So Anne, if we take maybe crafting a job description specifically, how do we deal with potential bias at that stage, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, but I suppose what I would say, the whole issue of unconscious bias, it's so important that we think about that throughout the whole process, through all the different steps, which is obviously a very important point to take. So just on unconscious bias, really first, in more sort of general terms, I think we all need to take responsibility, personal responsibility, for understanding what that bias might look like for ourselves, but also put in place awareness raising activities, training for everybody who's going to be involved in the recruitment process, so that they have the opportunity to go through that kind of reflective process also. And I think there is kind of classic ways that you can do that. For example, the Harvard Implicit Association test, and there's been some debate about that, but I still think it's a useful tool just to kind of to help you reflect. Not necessarily going to change your behaviour, but it's an interesting activity to undertake. But there are other things that you can do as well, other reflective exercises that you can just think about, how you feel about different groups and why that is. Was there some sort of trigger in a trigger event in your past, in your history, that has caused you to feel a particular way about a particular group? What was your experience of that group growing up? What did your parents tell you about that group? What have you learned from social media about that group, etc. So I think we all need to find space to kind of have those reflections. I think specifically in terms of crafting a job description, for me there are a couple of bias related danger points really. And first is around role stereotypes. Who have you got? What role are you recruiting to? What does an IT technician look like in your head? What does a customer services assistant look like in your head? What does a lawyer look like in your head? What does a senior manager look like in your head? And just again, reflect on that and make sure that you're not operating in a way that perpetuates that. You're not writing your biases into your job description. Now, I think it's also, if you're filling a role that is an existing role, what did the previous person look like? Are you just replicating that? What did you feel about how were they good in the role? Were they not good in the role? How does that sort of impact on what you write into the role now, into the job description, and obviously your own biases. I think what you need to do is try to be objective. And I would also say, I suppose for all parts of this the process, it's about, again, trying to find opportunities to involve different people in this. So you're not just sitting there in a darkened room writing the job description yourself, or even talking with your best and most trusted colleague at work, because they may look and think exactly the same way as you do, and that's why they're your trusted colleague, but it doesn't give you a different perspective. So try to bring other people into the process in terms of being a critical friend, and that gives others a really great learning opportunity as well. It's a two-way street, that if you involve others who are different in some way, you're offering them an opportunity which they may not have had previously. I think clearly you need to be clear about what the job is about, and then you need to be clear about what the person needs to be able to do, what skills, what knowledge, what experience they need to be able to do the job. So very objectively and clearly set out the tasks, and then the person's spec criteria. Beware of qualifications. Again, do you really need those? If so, why? What does that tell you? Does that help prove that the person is going to be able to do what you want them to do, or not? So I think those are the key points. I'm sure others will have other things to add as well.
Thank you, Anne. I know Amarjit wants to come in on that. So Amarjit, have you got something you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, we do a lot of research on behalf of organisations, talking to black staff, and some of the things specifically about JDs that have come back. I'll just give you some examples, which has meant people have paused or hesitated, is use of the reference to right fit to our organisation explicitly, working within our culture, that you need to be compliant and consistent. People have used language like non-white, more generic, sort of social loving, because that can have cultural connotations. And then a big one is English proficiency. And people will be actually very, very self-conscious from ethnic minority backgrounds on their English proficiency, even though they are absolutely outstanding on articulate. It hits and strikes a nerve bed. So, you know, there are alarm bells, and the only way is to talk to people who've either gone through the process and ask for some active feedback. So what we do is independently for organisations actually have confidential discussions with staff who haven't stepped up in the organisation, because there can be lazy truths formed about motivations and others for people who could be prospective candidates, but also people who've gone through the process or chosen not to, or not been successful.
Great, thank you, Amarjit. Completely agree. And Kira, I mean, I had another follow-up question to that, which was talking about the job advert and you know, making sure, I mean, the purpose of it is to attract candidates, but if we're not aware, we can actually have the opposite effect of turning people off. And, you know, to Amarjit's point, some of the things you might mention around the culture, social, English proficiency, etc., will just potentially be a barrier to some people even applying, so, and turn them off. So what are your tips, Kira, on ensuring that language used is not turning off the very groups of people you wish to attract?
That's such an important point, because I think often we don't really see the biased language straight off the bat to be very used to using that language, but often job adverts are just chock full of them, right? So you even have text analyzing software providers nowadays that can do a lot of that for you. You could work with someone like Amarjit as well on it to get a bit of that insight. But some of the things could be as simple as the job title. So using words such as chairman instead of chairperson, salesman instead of sales rep. And I know that sounds basic, but there's a lot that's still out there. A lot of it's still happening, and it's not always, again, purposeful, but you can see that. Words can also introduce bias. So there's been some interesting studies that have shown that certain words are more charged even with gender differences as well. So you're talking about your organization, and you're saying that as an organization, we aggressively go get our sales targets. We are first in class. That word aggressively is seen as a more male word. Now, if you use proactive, and you use that kind of terminology instead, you're saying the same thing, but then you're not turning off. People might go, well, I won't really fit into aggressive work culture, whereas that's not what you were saying, but that's what came across in that job advert. And that's a big part of that gender bias as well. Your colloquial language that you use there, so saying that we're a group where we really are a great group of guys, or we are one of the good guys, right? So you might have heard that. Immediately, you're creating that barrier there as well. Talking about workmanship. So again, this is more gender specific, but just like what Amarjit mentioned with those specific words as well, if you talk about a drinking culture or that socializing element, again, that can really be quite biased and also make some people feel like, well, I just won't be welcome, so I shouldn't apply. Assuming spouses are of the opposite gender. So if you're talking about any kind of benefits maybe, or you talk about support there, saying a wife or husband instead of partner or spouse, or those gender assuming language. So using pronouns in your job advert is also a bit of a no-go. Rather use they, them, rather than he, her, etc., because you might be missing out on quite a few people there as well that might not be gender conforming. And then another one that's quite key is ableism, and something that often gets overlooked. So a common requirement, if you think about a candidate needing to type a certain amount of words per minute that you might see, but the word type implies that that candidate, or maybe people they know, have hands. That implies that they probably shouldn't go for it, because actually you could be doing that data input through your voice into the computer through software. And words like walk, carry, that's an ableist concept in terms of how it comes across, when you could actually be really disadvantaging yourself by excluding those differently abled people that might make your organization better.
Great, thank you, Kira. Amarjit, if I can come back to you, when it comes to the initial sourcing stages and you go out to market, what steps do you think an organization can take over and above simply placing an advert and hoping for the best and crossing your fingers that a more diverse group of applicants actually apply?
Perhaps a few examples there, Claire. One is, if you are commissioning another organisation either to craft the job advert or, for example, you're working with recruitment companies, specialists, actually outline that first and foremost, that's a key commitment from you. So you absolutely challenge what may be orthodox practice and thinking. And that may be, in some cases, long-standing relationships having to be redefined and so on. And I mentioned that, Claire, because you will be aware that we've been working with Morgan Hunt and the other major recruitment companies in the further education sector, and we've actually defined our terms of engagement with all employers in the sector, and that joint statement has just come out today, you know, which is really great. We've been working on it for 9 months, so it's actually redefining, you know, those relationships which shape the job advert. Alongside that, I think there's proactivity in actively looking for talent and helping to develop that aspiration and expectation, one inside the organization and why not outside of the organization. An element of that for us is immersing those prospective candidates into practiced assessment centres. So we have been arranging residential weekends where some black candidates effectively come together with the real experience of going through assessment centres and others, so that there's not a naivety gap in the context of how they perform. And I think the other thing is something that Anne and Kira have mentioned, which is think about your advertising policy. You know, think about where and what communities you want to target, and all of that data's out there now in the context of all areas are getting more ethnically diverse. There's no excuse in not targeting those areas or those, you know, sort of people in order to attract.
Thank you, Amarjit. And did you want to add something else in there?
Yeah, I think that was Amarjit gave a sort of great response there. I think one thing that I always feel is very productive and proactive and positive in terms of general attraction, and it comes back to this authenticity piece for the organisation. What demonstrates or what shows to all those prospective applicants out there that the organisation really is walking the talk on diversity and inclusion. So, you know, obviously your website needs to look great in terms of imagery and reflect diversity in that respect. But specifically, I think being transparent about where the organisation is on its journey, and I think even if it's not great or you don't feel it's great so far, to put some data out there on your website, you know, and I know, you know, obviously for larger organisations have to publish the gender pay gap, you know, and hopefully the ethnicity pay gap will be coming on stream, you know, but thinking about what data you can put in the public domain, like your workforce profile, and, you know, just for people who are interested in working for organisation, for them to be able to see where you are, what you have identified as your key priorities and your objectives, and what actions you are actually putting in place to address them. So, you know, it's almost like, yeah, it's being very truthful. It's giving people the opportunity to see you warts and all, but I think people are reassured if they know that you're doing something about it, even if it doesn't look great currently. So I think that's, yeah.
Agree, and there's a certain honesty to being that transparent and saying, look, we're not there yet. We know that, we know we have issues, and this is what we're doing to address them, but putting it out there, because actually potentially candidates, if they don't see anything and they can tell it doesn't look massively diverse, that's you know, an issue, and potentially will turn them off even applying. So not being afraid to being honest about where you are. Thank you. And if I could come to you again, kind of moving on that theme, you know, we've talked about biases. We all have inherent biases, and we make assumptions all the time, every day, you know, with our recruitment decisions, with everything we do. So what are your tips on reducing, it's difficult to prevent completely, but if you can prevent bias during the screening process in particular, And by that, I mean focusing on the attributes that are required for the job rather than maintaining that specific qualifications are the only criteria to reject potential candidates.
Yeah, I think, again, you know, one of my recommendations would be to try to involve a range of people. Again, it's an opportunity for those people who might not necessarily classically be involved in a recruitment process, but to get different perspectives. I think, you know, many organisations now are starting to implement blind or anonymised screening. So by that we mean making sure that the information available about applicants to the screeners, there's any personal information that might be irrelevant has been removed. And we've already mentioned how important names are in terms of our tendency to have bias. And again, you know, there is much research that shows that bias does kick in if names sound non-white or white, and that applicants with non-English or non-white sounding names have to apply for many more posts before they get an opportunity for an interview. So I think, you know, that's just one example. You know, and another thing is, you know, which university or what the academic experience and history of that individual is. You know, I was talking to, you know, my daughter's boyfriend just recently. His organisation, he said nobody would get a look in unless you're from 4 or 5 universities. Wouldn't even get past first base. It's that biased, basically. So I think, you know, elements, again, age, you know, ageism kicks in. Again, that's difficult, isn't it, to hide, because you're asking for experience and you have dates and that type of thing. But think about what information is essential and what is not. Now, you know, again, I think there's been different research around how effective blind or anonymised screening is, but what I would say, it's definitely a good place to start. And again, what it indicates, if people become aware of that is your policy, it sends a positive message to those applying that you're actually, you know, you're doing something to take this seriously and to try and create an objective process. I think, you know, the other things are sticking very carefully to the person spec criteria that you've mapped out, applying robust scoring, also seeing each applicant as an individual. It's trying not to compare one to the other, but looking for the potential, looking for the different ways in which each individual meets the person spec criteria, and not comparing, you know, applicant number 4 with applicant number 3 that you've just looked at. Treat each one as an individual initially, and take it from there. And look, you know, just have a mindset of looking outside the box, you know, and moving away from your stereotypes.
Thank you, Anne. Kira, you wanted to throw something in there?
Yeah, just to add to what you said there, Anne, about the so anonymizing of CVs as well. So some really interesting research that our amazing group of research psychologists at Thomas conducted, and they presented it at the International Test Conference, was they looked at what is the effect then if you don't have that blind CV of having assessments or not having assessments involved. And what was really interesting about that was once you added, even with your screening process, a type of psychometric assessment, so looking at the behavioral skills required for the role, or looking at, you know, the learning fluidity or ability that's needed in the role, etc. Looking at these specific areas, if you include that in the screening, it really reduced that unconscious bias as well, because then people starting to not think about the kind of person they like, but thinking about, does it really fit with that, what you said around that person spec that we've really carved out for this role? Or how could we maybe have a bit more of an interesting candidate because it's a different person spec, but because it took some data in there, it stopped being subjective and became more objective. So it had a really big impact on reducing that bias as well, which was quite interesting.
Great, thank you, Kira. Amarjit, do you want to add something to that as well?
Just to corroborate Anne's point about be careful of defaulting to the institutions that the candidates may be studied from. Our national research corroborates Anne's point, which is overwhelmingly, interestingly, irrespective of the qualifications that people may achieve at A-level, Black students are less likely to get into the Russell Group institutions. So what does that tell you about potential and other things?
Yep, great. And yeah, and if organisations like that are just focusing on particular universities, which is still here regularly from certain clients, then that's a real blocker. Thank you, Amarjit. Just to come back to you, what is your advice, Amarjit, to organisations who are in the process of making their recruitment practices more inclusive? But it's kind of making the shift. It's a subtle shift, but it's a really important one. Shifting to screening candidates in and not out, so that you're minimising the roadblocks and barriers.
Yeah, I think the first thing is screening in is absolutely permissible under the law. So Anne started the whole morning off by referring to legislation. People need to be confident and also have the strength of their convictions in executing the law, which talks about positive action. So if you have gaps in the context of participation or profile of your workforce, the law permits you to take positive steps in order to address those gaps. And I think that's at the heart of those considerations as you go through interview and assessment, and finally, decision-making phase. If there are candidates that are very, very close or have shown some elements, default to positive action, because that's really, really important. And as Anne said, just taking that step and following your convictions will just send huge messages, not only inside the organisation, outside, and surely that's positive.
Thank you, Amarjit. We've covered a few of the questions I was going to ask actually in some of our other answers, and I'm aware I do want to answer at least some of the Q&A that are coming from the floor. So I'm going to kind of go a little bit quicker through what I plan to ask, and then hopefully still have some time at the end. So Kira, if I could come back to you. You obviously are a member of the Thomas Employee Representative Group, or the Diversity and Inclusion Group at Thomas. So, on that point, many organisations have set up employee representative groups as part of their diversity and inclusion focus. How do you think these groups can contribute to and help to make the recruitment process more inclusive?
I think it's key. I think if you don't have that sort of ownership from an employee group, you don't really get that sort of sucked in cultural change. It doesn't really embed in the organization because employees don't feel like they're part of it as well. So I'll definitely speak from my Thomas perspective here. In 2020, a large group of us volunteered to form our own D&I steering groups. And this consisted of employees across the business, our international business, as well as smaller subgroups focusing on specific areas. And we did this in conjunction with the D&I audits as well. I went to an external provider, wanted to find out, okay, let's get some really good information and find out where are our gaps, where can we start improving? And that helped us to see what we want to focus on. So things like we have a data subgroup that's focusing on, like you mentioned, Anne, what data are we really gathering about our people? Are we doing enough there? We have a strategy group, we have a vision group. We've got the group that I'm in and that I am the workstream lead of is the short-term initiatives group. So what we do is in our group, we look at how can we, in quick wins, and I hate the word quick wins because it still takes effort, but how can we find ways where we can keep the conversation going? So we started doing monthly breakfast talks or short talks where 20 to 30 minutes, but we talk about a very key topic, and that's been so instrumental. So our last talk was around how do we involve more international language diverse people in the organization, because yes, we speak the business English, but not everybody's that proficient, or it's not their first language. What does that mean? We had a talk on menopause in the workplace. So really interesting stuff. And some of it's been from internal, but we've also got external speakers in. So really finding ways where, again, the ownership is in the groups though. So it's not from the C-suite level. Yes, you need some of that sponsorship from that level. You need some of that buy-in from that level. But when you see that the employees that are on your level, the discussions that are taking place, and that it's continued discussions, it can't be a once-off thing, then it's really, really valuable. So it's ongoing. And it's something we've realized is business critical. So we make sure it's promoted at every level of the organization as well.
Thank you, Kira. Amarjit, if I could come back to you, and I think this is something you and I have discussed in the past, and we've certainly discussed it over this process we've gone through over the last few months. But how do you feel organisations can use interview panels to make their process more inclusive and diverse?
I think obvious one is representation, you know, the composition of the interview panels. It's also framing questions which enable people to articulate their experiences and their competencies, drawing upon the breadth of their experience. A classical one, Claire, is, you know, how in your current or your previous role have you demonstrated those elements? There may be candidates who may not have had those opportunities and their current and previous role, but may have other experience to draw on. So it's framing the questions. And a little bit of a bugbear for me is that, especially the more senior you go, you get extended processes, and thinking about the range of activities and also the composition of those sub-panels as you go through. I had a need to intervene on behalf of a candidate a few months ago who was putting themselves forward for a CEO role in one of the most diverse areas in the whole of England. And yet the 2-day assessment centre undertaken and defined by the college with the help of a search company had exclusively white panels on any of them, and they didn't see it. And to be fair, they were hugely grateful, but also embarrassed that it took a critical friend in order to, you know, present that. So my final point is actually engage critical friend, because some of the friends you just don't see because of those innate biases that exist organisationally or personally. So critical friendship in a safe way, you know, is really, really important.
Great, thank you, Amarjit. We actually have a question from the floor, which I'll throw in because it's relevant to what we're saying here. And somebody has asked, what tips can you give to ensure your interview panels are diverse without asking the same people of colour every time, I presume?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off, but I'm sure Kira and Anne will be even more expert on this, which is you don't have to restrict to your own organisation. There could be peer organisations, or there could be community groups, or there could be the supplier networks that have people that you can draw upon. And actually that's a double bonus, because not only do you ensure the diversity, you bring new perspectives into the appointment process, but there's also something about the reputation of the organisation then simmers through, which is they really mean it, you know, when it comes to diversity. So there's no shortage of black people out there, guys. You just need to look at the demographics.
Yeah, great, thank you, Amarjit. And Anne, what would you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just absolutely echo what Amarjit has said. I mean, I think that's often a concern for organisations who feel that, or the reality is that at the level that is felt appropriate to be taking those decisions, or for people to be sitting on a panel, you know, the representation of Black, Asian, minority, ethnic people is not great, is not great, which is what we're all talking about here. But you know, and that can be an issue if there's a lot of recruitment going on, and that those people feel that they're always being asked to come onto the panel or whatever, you know. But absolutely what Amarjit says, you know, think outside the box, but in terms of external people. But I would also say, you know, think outside the box in terms of internal people, more junior colleagues from Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups. And this goes back to the point, it's like, this can be a fantastic, you know, and I have known organisations that have done this fantastic learning and development opportunity. And we, you know, okay, we're talking about recruitment here, but one of the key issues is progression of Black, Asian, minority ethnic talent, you know, and retention, and investing in those people so they want to stay in your organisation and that they feel they're having the same progression opportunities as their white peers. So, you know, so offering an opportunity for more junior people to be, you know, interviewing it's asking questions that you know you're going to ask already. I mean, you know, I know there's more to it than that, but people can really learn from that, and those employees can, you know, can then see what a great answer looks like. They can experience that, and then they learn from that themselves. So I also think it's not be fixed like, oh, you've got to be at this level before you can interview. As long as those people have had some unconscious bias training and understand the process and what their role is, you know, I think, yeah, we can probably cast the net a little bit wider.
Great, thank you, Anne. Kira, do you want to follow up with that?
Yeah, just to sort of supplement to Anne's point, there is that support from the organisation is key. Because you don't want someone to just be in a situation where they feel, I am just here as a token, right? I am just here because they had to do a box ticking exercise. Because then if you actually build in that mentorship as part of it, that's also going to really lead to your organization is going to be better in the long run with that. So that proper support that some hiring managers might feel like, oh, well, I just want to get these positions filled. But it's, again, getting the commitment from them to also do a bit of that peer mentoring or mentoring to the people that you bring into those panels is really, really important.
Yeah, not just throwing them in with that support makes complete sense. Thank you, Kira. I'm actually going to go to our Q&A from the floor now, because really there's some good questions here and it'd be great to cover them. There's one question in particular that's kind of come up in various forms, so I'll ask it once and hopefully it'll make sense. So somebody has asked, at a recent D&I event, a delegate raised concerns that inclusive recruitment and improving diversity means discriminating against white men like him. How can we get the message across to people like this who see inclusion as a personal attack? And they put in brackets, is it worth trying? So who would like to kick off that?
I don't mind.
Go for it, Kira.
It's definitely worth trying. I think it's always worth. Also, I think part of that trying is validating someone's experience that's different to yours. So in terms of not saying that it's necessarily, yes, that's the truth of what's happening, but understanding where is that response coming from? Is it coming from a fear base of, I'm not going to be supported in this organization, or this organization doesn't look like me anymore? Where is that coming from? And really diving in. So bringing that person, make them part of your D&I subgroup or D&I representative group. Get them involved in the conversations. Expose them to different cultural identities, different ethnic minorities, all of that kind of stuff. Because that's the key. People don't respond like that just because they feel they should. There's a reason behind it, and tapping into that could really help. So then, rather than just saying, well, you should believe this and that's that, bringing them involved, then they can be one of the advocates down the line potentially for D&I in your organization.
Thank you, Kira. And do you have something you want to add to that?
Yeah, just a great answer from Kira. I think that it's also partly about, yeah, it's about talking with that person, isn't it? Understanding where they're coming from, and it's about trying to pinpoint the relevance to them, you know, and most people, you know, most straight white men have a daughter, a partner, a wife, or somebody where they can, you know, if you can kind of strike a chord, with a story about or some evidence and data that is going to be meaningful to that person, you are part way there to persuading them that this is kind of sensible. What I would also say, I think it's, you know, and it's a very slow process, but it goes back to something that Kira said previously as well, in terms of just generally trying to build that awareness and interest in diversity. You know, talking about diversity and inclusion should become the norm and become something we do all the time, and that's very much something that we've been trying to do at Marshalls. It's, you know, because we create specialist e-learning on diversity and inclusion, but what we're really trying to promote now through sort of broader consultancy and training is that this, you know, e-learning is the start, it's the springboard. You know, so often it's just something that people feel they have to do, but we want to keep that learning alive. You know, it doesn't stop with that. It's really important, you know, and we've created what we call our monthly diversity and inclusion nudge, which we send out to all clients. So it takes one topic, and, you know, interestingly, Kira, we've had menopause just recently, and menopause and menstruation, our most recent nudge, and it's just a one pager in a very accessible format that can be shared internally within organisations, that just says, you know, these are a couple of key points and things to think about menopause, about workplace premenstrual policies, and then it signposts to some information, you know, not heavy research, but some animations or something. So it's very accessible that anybody can, you know. So what we're hoping is that it just, you know, talking about, you know, and diversity is a huge topic, isn't it? You know, it's talking about some of these things, just thinking about them, it's part of the culture, part of the DNA. And then that one person who's a bit cynical finds that, you know, if they're not interested, they're kind of getting a bit left out. So I think it's small steps. It's small steps.
Thank you, Anne. Amarjit, did you want to add something to that as well?
Just a supplementary, really, which is, and thank you to the participant who's asked the question, because that's the first step, actually opening up. So for me, it's you cannot let feelings and thoughts fester. So the people's perspectives, irrespective of where they come from, is critical. And I can imagine it can feel threatening, as you said, if you have a very, very enthusiastic agenda around diversity and inclusion. Where do you sit as a heterosexual white person of a particular age and so on, whatever? Well, the important thing is that voice is just as legitimate as anyone else's. So it's actually opening it up, putting it out in the open, legitimizing that fear and that particular perspective. And then, as Anne and Kira said so eloquently, it's actually involving them in the conversation and the evolution of the organisation going forward.
Great, thank you, Amarjit. I'll try and do a couple more questions. I think we have actually touched on ageism, probably when this person asked, it hadn't come up, but ageism is illegal and it seems to be an add-on in terms of diversity and inclusion with organisations, or maybe an afterthought. And older workers, as we know, have many skills and an exceptional expertise to offer an organisation. So what's the group's thoughts on developing this as an area within the overall strategy? Who would like to kick off that? I mean, go on, Amarjit, I can see you talking.
Yeah, no, all I can say is I mentioned some of the work, the critical friend work that we do for organisations in interviewing people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds. And just this week, I interviewed a 70-year-old member of staff in an organisation who was white Irish, and actually, whilst the research was about ethnicity and background and so on, his biggest recurring point was actually how he was perceived in the context of his age. And therefore, Kira's point about intersectionality really came into being. He loves his job. He can't see where he wants to end. He's getting great support inside the organisation. He's a rapport as a 74-year-old with students who are a quarter of his age is quite inspiring, but he still feels insecure. So I think there are absolutely legitimate points, and it comes back to, you've got to listen to those voices, and if you really mean it, you've got to take and build those into whatever strategy you take forward.
Great. Anne, would you like to finish off that with some comments following that?
Yeah, I think that's a great example, Amarjit, and I'd just like to add to that something, you know, the intersectionality aspect. You know, firstly, I would say absolutely, you know, thank you for the question. I absolutely agree that sometimes it feels like there's a little bit of a pecking order in terms of, you know, the diversity strands, but we need to be alert to absolutely all of them and have a really comprehensive you know, strategy that looks at each, but also looks at those intersectionalities. I just wanted to share, you know, I mentioned we'd got our latest sort of nudge on menopause, and we recently did a survey on menopause, and we were interested to ask what might stop you if you were someone who was experiencing menopause at work. What would stop you from talking to your line manager about that? And also, what would stop line managers talking to an employee who they knew was experiencing menopause? What would, you know, so what would be the barriers? And, you know, so we're talking mainly here for older, slightly older women. And, you know, one of the key points that quite to my surprise, we found that on both parts, both on the part of the line manager and the woman, embarrassment wasn't a big issue, but for the women, it was more about the fear of being stereotyped and assumptions being made about them as an older woman in the workplace and being judged inappropriately because of that. So I think that's just another example of how, you know, age intersects with other things that are going on, other sort of characteristics, and is really important to consider.